Good morning from the Freedom of Information and Privacy Association. I'm Patrick Farnsworth, and this is your Access and Privacy Online News Summary for Saturday, March 28th. This week, Ontario's government is moving to shield political records from access to information laws, and it has set up a direct clash with the province's independent privacy commissioner. At the federal level, a new bill aimed at protecting Canada's electoral system is raising early questions, including whether privacy concerns are addressed. We're also tracking cybersecurity developments across Canada, including fallout from the Nova Scotia Power breach and a blackmail attempt targeting a sitting legislator. Internationally, a U.S. jury has found Meta responsible for harms to children, as governments continue to look at how to regulate social media and artificial intelligence. As always, we'll have all the links in the show notes. Let's dive in. Submissions have now closed for the People's Consultation on AI, with more than 65 received from individuals, organizations, and micro-consultations held across Canada. Those submissions reflect a wide range of perspectives, from labor organizations and academic researchers to civil society groups and community-led consultations, all contributing to the national conversation on how artificial intelligence should be governed. FIPA has also submitted its recommendations alongside partners including the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group, and the findings are expected to inform ongoing work on AI governance and oversight. Late this week, the federal government has introduced Bill C-4, described as legislation to strengthen Canada's electoral processes and democratic institutions. At first reading, the bill raises a notable concern. In legislation framed around modern threats to democracy, privacy appears only once, a gap that is likely to draw our continued scrutiny as the bill moves forward. Starting in Ontario, the Canadian press reports that Ontario's legislature has returned after a prolonged break, which the opposition has called undemocratic, with freedom of information expected to be a central issue in the spring session. The Ford government is preparing legislation that would exempt records of the premier, cabinet ministers, their staff, and parliamentary assistants from access to information laws, a move that follows an ongoing dispute over access to Premier Doug Ford's cell phone records. Ford has repeatedly suggested that if his phone records were to be made public, it would jeopardize the personal and health information of residents who contact him for help. The province's Information and Privacy Commissioner has now weighed in and clarified that these types of records should be disclosed when used for government business, and that the existing law already prevents the release of sensitive personal information when these types of records are reviewed prior to release. Opposition critics say the proposed changes would significantly weaken transparency and limit public oversight, while the government maintains they would bring Ontario in line with other jurisdictions. The commissioner said retroactively changing the law sends a message that if oversight bodies get in the way, politicians are merely changing the rules. In another move from the province, Ontario is planning to create a province-wide electronic medical record system for primary care, more than 2 decades after the government first embarked on what became a scandal-plagued e-health project. Opposition health critics said creating integrated electronic medical health records is a commendable goal, but they are skeptical about the rollout under Premier Doug Ford's government. Particularly, they pointed to security of patient data and privacy as key concerns, especially given a privacy breach involving home care patients' data last year. At the same time, access to information reporting is continuing to highlight gaps in environmental accountability in that province. Ed Smith, LGI reporter at The Pointer, tells us records show uncertainty around ownership of a former General Motors site, after years of stalled rehabilitation efforts, raising questions about who is responsible for monitoring and remediation. An FOI investigation has even revealed a political staffer in the minister's office intervening, ordering the Pointer's media request be closed without any answers provided when they contacted the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks for comment time and time again. Also on the environmental front, Sue Nielsen, LJ reporter at the Timiskaming Speaker reports residents near a refinery site are raising concerns about potential chemical exposure, calling for clearer public disclosure of environmental and health risks. Thousands of documents obtained through a Freedom of Information request have revealed details of hazardous material located at the abandoned cobalt refinery site located in Coleman Township. The documents revealed that there are PCBs, mercury, arsenic, and other chemicals at the cobalt refinery, which have been found to have leached off the refinery property and into a creek where people fish and swim. Together, these developments point to a broader pattern where both policy changes and information gaps are shaping how transparency is experienced on the ground. Turning to national developments. The Canadian press reports that federal departments and agencies are expected to reduce staffing by 12,000 full-time equivalent positions as part of broader efforts to manage spending. Among the expected job losses are 1,793 positions at Public Services and Procurement Canada, 900 jobs at Statistics Canada, and 942 at Health Canada. Library and Archives Canada says it's gradually reducing access to information and privacy functions and the proactive review of historical records functions over a 3-year period. While framed as a fiscal measure, reductions of this scale can have practical implications for service delivery, including delays in access to information processing and reduced administrative capacity. Staying in Ottawa, critics are highlighting the need to support Inuit communities facing growing concerns about foreign surveillance and economic dependence. The report says those attempts could take the form of Chinese investment in mining projects, offers of collaboration with Chinese polar research vessels, and financial support for badly needed infrastructure, such as transportation links and broadband internet. The Inuit Tapirit Kanatami, which represents Inuit in Canada, has said repeatedly that Inuit want to play a role in defending Canada's Arctic sovereignty and that northern communities must benefit from and be consulted on defense investments in the region. The issue highlights the intersection of national security, data governance, and Indigenous sovereignty. Meanwhile, the Canadian press reports that Hydro-Quebec is seeking input on linking its grid with proposed Nova Scotia wind farms as part of broader efforts to expand renewable energy connections. The provincially owned utility has issued a formal request for information from energy developers to help it determine timelines and costs for building transmission lines and other technologies. However, the utility's request does not commit it to make any investments at this point. The utility has 16 interconnections with neighboring jurisdictions and says this allows it to occupy a strategic position at the heart of the region's major energy corridors. The proposal raises questions about cross-provincial coordination and how public consultation will be handled in large-scale infrastructure planning. Shifting to privacy and cybersecurity. The Canadian press reports that RCMP in Alberta have made an arrest in a phone upgrade scam, where fraudsters impersonate telecom providers to obtain personal information and redirect newly ordered devices. If the fraud works, the victim then orders the phone through the actual phone provider. When the phone arrives, the fraudster then calls back to say it's the wrong phone and asks the victim to send it to a different address, allowing the fraudster to keep the new device. Police say the scheme relies on convincing communications and social engineering tactics, making it increasingly difficult for individuals to distinguish legitimate contact from fraud. Nova Scotia Power has agreed to strengthen its cybersecurity protections following a breach that exposed customer data. Nova Scotia Power sent a compliance letter to Commissioner Philippe Dufresne saying it will delete customer social security numbers that it has on file, and it will also provide his office with the findings of an external security audit by the end of October. The development represents continued fallout from the cyber attack on the utility last year and highlights ongoing risks to critical infrastructure systems that hold sensitive personal information. Also in Nova Scotia, Devin Stevens reports that a legislator was targeted in a cyber attack involving a Bitcoin blackmail demand after hackers accessed personal data. When the demand was refused, private material was released, prompting warnings about the risks public officials face and the broader implications for democratic institutions. Police declined to say if the hacker was an international or domestic actor, saying it's part of an ongoing investigation. A report last year from the Communications Security Establishment of Canada said ransomware attacks are increasing and will likely remain a challenge with the continued development of technologies like artificial intelligence and cryptocurrency. Now to international stories. In the United States, a New Mexico jury has found that Meta's platforms contributed to harm to children's mental health and safety in a case that could shape future litigation and regulation. The jury determined that Meta made false or misleading statements and agreed that Meta engaged in unconscionable trade practices that unfairly took advantage of the vulnerabilities and inexperience of children. Jurors found there were thousands of violations, each counting separately toward a penalty of $375 million, less than one-fifth of what prosecutors were looking for. The decision adds to growing scrutiny of how platform design and algorithms may affect young users, and comes as other courts and countries continue reviewing extensive evidence on the risks social media platforms pose to children. That includes Brazil, where new legislation is being rolled out to strengthen online protections for minors, reflecting a broader global shift toward increased safeguards in digital environments. Under the new law, minors under 16 are required to link their social media accounts to a legal guardian to ensure supervision. The legislation also prohibits platforms from using addictive features such as infinite scroll and the automatic play of videos. Digital services are also obliged to implement an effective age verification mechanism that goes beyond self-declaration that the user is over 18 to protect them from accessing inappropriate or prohibited material. Shifting back to the United States, the White House is urging Congress to take a light touch approach to AI regulation, even as concerns continue to grow about privacy, bias, and misuse. The goal is to lay out a broad framework for how it wants Congress to address concerns about artificial intelligence without curbing growth or innovation in the sector. The legislative blueprint outlines a half-dozen guiding principles for lawmakers, focusing on protecting children, preventing electricity costs from surging, respecting intellectual property rights, preventing censorship, and educating Americans on using the technology. Meanwhile, in Nevada, license plate reader cameras are now widespread, but there are no comprehensive laws governing how the data is collected, stored, or used, raising concerns about large-scale surveillance. Policymakers said it's been difficult to keep up with the pace of the technology, and it's unclear just how ubiquitous the devices are. Information on where the cameras are located is not publicly available, and in some jurisdictions, such as the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, entered into the agreements without public discussion. And in West Virginia, a new campaign finance law will remove public access to donor-employer information, limiting transparency around political funding and influence. The public would be able to see that consultants are funding a particular politician, but not that they work for a pharmaceutical or power company. Previously, if a dozen employees of a butcher donated to politicians who later awarded a lucrative bacon contract to the business, each donation would list the company. Under the new law, the public would only know that the donations came from various butchers. Separately, a judge has sided with the New York Times in a challenge to limits on reporter access to the Pentagon, reinforcing the role of press access in government accountability. The Times sued the Pentagon and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth in December, claiming the credentialing policy violates the journalist's constitutional rights to free speech and due process. The judge ruled that the policy violates the First and Fifth Amendments, rights to free speech and due process. A spokesperson for the Pentagon says it disagrees with the decision and are pursuing an immediate appeal. And finally, reporting highlights how special interests continue to cultivate influence with lawmakers through sponsored travel and access, raising ongoing questions about transparency and ethics in public office. Nearly 120 organizations, including nonprofits, corporations, foreign governments, state agencies, tribes, and campaigns, spent at least $1.2 million on travel for legislators last year, according to the lawmakers' annual financial disclosures filed earlier this month. $1.1 million was picked up by nonprofits that are largely allowed to keep their donors secret, leaving the true source of the funding murky. And in a story that clearly identifies the shift in the United States to a theocratic authoritarianism, as the United States continues its crusade in the Middle East, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth hosted his first monthly Christian worship service at the Pentagon since the Iran war began. Hegseth claims to have read from a chaplain praying during a live stream service. Hegseth frequently invokes his evangelical faith as head of the armed forces, depicting a Christian nation trying to vanquish its foes with military might. A lawsuit was also filed over the services by Americans United for Separation of Church and State. The suit seeks to enforce a public records request from December, asking the Pentagon for internal communications about the worship services, their cost, guests, and any complaints received from employees. It's a far cry from concepts of social justice and reflects many of the issues international courts have been flagging in current U.S. actions. As always, we hope today's stories helped you stay informed about the forces shaping privacy, transparency, and accountability. FIPA will continue tracking Bill C-25 and developments in AI governance in the weeks ahead. To support this work, please subscribe through FIPA News Monitoring, or consider making a donation. Our writer is Sean Fisk. Music is by the mysterious Breakmaster Cylinder. I'm Patrick Farnsworth. Thank you for listening. Stay safe and stay informed.